Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and I'm going to continue with Jude. One of the things that I noticed I didn't say last time, which is kind of important, is that she admits that she's not pregnant. She doesn't say she lied about it, but she does say that it was just a misunderstanding. That quacky doctor around here told me I was, and so what was I supposed to do? And Jude is like, you know, I could have had time. I could have had some time to get some money or, you know, something like that. And her response basically is, what's done is done, which is exactly what Lady Macbeth says to Macbeth after they kill some people and he starts to feel guilty about it. She says, what's done is done. Can't go back. So let me just read you the last line of that chapter. There was perhaps something fortunate in the fact that the immediate reason for his marriage had proved now non-existent. But the marriage remained. And that's, you know, that tone of Hardy. It just makes me think back to the poem that he wrote about his own marriage, where he said, wherever two souls wasted in their prime. So as life goes on for them, what you see in chapter 10 is it's time to kill the pig. And this is very symbolic for many reasons. One, most importantly, I guess, is because it shows naturalism. So if you had a question that addressed something like naturalism, this would be a really good passage to point to. But, you know, you would also have to point to how it demonstrates the theme of the book as a whole. So I think by the time you're done with this video, you will be able to do that. But, you know, poor Jude, he's been listening to this pig cry, and he later finds out that's because Arabella was starving him, so that when she did kill him, she didn't have to mess with his innards, and it would be, I guess, a cleaner job. And it snows, and they wait. They actually have somebody else coming to kill the pig, but he's late. And Arabella says, "Okay, he's not coming. We're gonna have to do it ourselves, or I'll do it." And Jude says, "Well, of course you're not gonna do it." So now Jude has to like man up and try to kill this pig, and he's already feeling very morose about it, because he's thinking, I fed this pig with my own hands, and now I'm going to go murder him. And of course, this is not Arabella. She has no problem, you know, killing the pig. And she calls Jude a tender-hearted fool. And she's explaining that when we kill him, you can't just stick that thing right in there and kill him right away. He's got to bleed out slowly. And this is like, you know, even more appalling to Jude. Like, we're going to kill him slowly? And she's, of course, you know, this is how, she knows how it's done. She knows how the best way. And notice that the best way for industry, for commerce, is the worst way for nature. And it kind of reminds me of the passage where Jude he's wanting to feed the birds. His job is to scare the birds. And he's wondering, why is it that what's good for God's birds is bad for God's gardener, and reverse. So you see this as, you know, a naturalistic quality is a very realistic view of how cruel, you know, sometimes nature is. If you've ever watched the Animal Planet, or if you're like me and you live in the country and you've actually seen a hawk come down and just grab this little squirrel and take off, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's crazy, you know. You don't want to see things like that, but that's the way it is. And so if we're making some argument that there's proof that there's God, because all you've got to do is look at the beautiful lilies. Well, there's a little bit more to it, isn't there? There's a little more of violence in this natural world. And of course we contribute to it. More than anybody else, we contribute to it. So you can read the part where the pig is dying, but I'm basically going to go to this part when it's over. And Jude says, "Thank God," Jude said, "he's dead." "What's God got to do with such a messy job as pig killing, I should like to know," she said scornfully. "Poor folks must live." I know, he says. And he says, "I don't scold you. There's just something else about this whole ordeal and how it represents this whole world we're living in that just seems horrifying." And, to Arabella's point, poor folks must live. What do you think we're supposed to be doing here? We're surviving. They're going to go do what they have to do to survive. The pig is going to kill something else and be ruthless with it. I don't know that they would actually do that, but like if you've ever had a dog that brings you back, or a cat that brings you back a present. In my case with Oliver, it's a lizard, and you don't get near Oliver while he has this because he starts to growl in a way I've never heard before. And it's just that instinct that, I caught this. This is mine. But what does that say about our relationship with nature, nature's relationship with God, all these kind of things, and they're unraveling around the time of Darwin's Origin of Species. And so I want to show you this quote from Ralph Pite, who wrote The Guarded Life, which is a very interesting title, The Guarded Life of Thomas Hardy. And he brings up, now remember, this is if you saw my introduction, this is the guy who said that, during this time when people were reading Origin of Species, Christians actually committed suicide. So it was a very serious thing for Victorians to go through the dark night of the soul. And Pite says, more seriously, Darwin's theory implied that if nature were an image or reflection of God, then God was horrible, either blindly indifferent to what he created, or a being that used predation and brutality in order to achieve its ends. Humanity was not superior to other animals, only better adapted to present circumstances. And if you think about that animal reference, that Jude thinks, if I just a step above the animals here, I wouldn't have given in to my temptation, and I wouldn't be ruining my life, because that's what he's doing. He's stuck. And so, like I've said before, this is also Hardy's obsession. This is his struggle too, about trying to reconcile all of this. So let me just add this quote. Losing religious faith created a powerful nostalgia for those securities in Hardy as well as other people at that time. Their faith's disappearance seemed to be accompanied by the loss of unconditional acceptance. When God the Father vanished or turned cruel, it felt as if their parents had abandoned them. And if you've ever gone through the dark night of the soul, it does, if you grew up as a very strong believer, like I did as a child, and then you start learning a lot of other things, and you're kind of stuck wondering, well, what if this is true? And what if it's not true? And what am I doing here? And it becomes almost like an existential crisis, because then nothing's meaningful anymore. And this is a problem with Thomas Hardy. So once Jude he's out and about, he hears kind of what he's already suspected, and that's Arabella's girlfriends are laughing about how Arabella had really duped Jude, and how her scheme was playing out, and how it could have easily been my scheme. If I had wanted him, I could have done that. And so Jude is even feeling, more and more just disgusted and humiliated. And he goes back to Arabella and confronts her about this. And in the meantime, she's got lard on her hands, like hot grease. And she gets angry that his books are, I guess, in the kitchen or something like that. And she starts tossing them aside. My guess is this is not a big place to put anything. And as she's picking up the books, her fingers are like sticking to the pages, leaving its fingerprints, basically. And this just horrifies him. Like this is it. He's been ready to blow. And he grabs her a little bit, and he's just saying, I want you to tell me that you're not going to touch my books. And he's aggressive, and he's grabbing her, and in the struggle, that extension of her hair falls out. This is enough for Arabella to go out in the streets, mess up her hair even more. She unbuttons her dress a little bit, and she just looks like she's battered and runs out and says, see what my husband has done to me. And then, Jude doesn't look much better, because then he's got to go and get her and drag her back inside. So, of course, and then somebody comments, good God, deliver us. Look at these people. And so they kind of make a scene, which is never a good thing in Victorian times. And then she says something to him that hasn't really occurred to Jude before. And that is going back to his history about the way his parents. And by the way, by this time, Arabella has taken off the rose-colored glasses too. She's finding out that I'm not really any better off with him than I was with my parents. In fact, it might even be harder. And besides that, Jude is boring to her. All he wants to do is read. All he cares about is his books. And they don't have any kind of intellectual connection. They are not compatible at all. Just like in the beginning, where he says he had nothing in common with her except locality. And so she says to him, and to another argument, going to ill-use me on principle, as your father ill-used your mother, and your father's sister ill-used her husband, she asked. You all be a quite queer lot as husbands and wives. And now Jude has to go back to his aunt to get this clear. Did my mom and dad do this? And notice this is a little bit of a hint of what's going to happen when he meets his cousin Sue, who's going to be the main love interest. And back then, it didn't matter if you were cousins, but notice the father runs off on the mother. The father's sister is Sue's mother. She runs off. Neither one of them are suited for marriage. And the aunt has tried to kind of explain this to Jude. She says, the follies were not made for wedlock. It was never seen to sit well upon us. There's somewhat in our blood that won't take kindly to the notion to being bound to do what we're readily enough not bound. That's why you ought to have hearkened to me, not a married. And notice this is the same aunt that found Jude as a complete burden. It's like, why didn't you die with your mother and father? We all would have been better off. But now she's getting old. So now she's the burden in society. And Jude could have, now he's useful to her. He should have just stayed. But, the main point of what she's saying is that it's in our blood. And what it reminds me of, and I'm pretty sure this is what Hardy was thinking, is the sins of the father, which is very much an Old Testament idea. But if you read several verses in the Bible in the Old Testament about the sins of the father, they seem to contradict each other, as Scripture often does, which is why it's never a good idea to use Scripture alone, sola scriptura, but to really try to see the whole context. So I think you see better in the Gospel of John, and just show this verse to you really quick, see what I mean. As he passed, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God may be displayed in him. So, without even using the Old Testament verses, you can understand the mindset. Was it his father? Who sinned? Who sinned here? That would be kind of an unusual question for us today, but apparently that's the way people thought. And so Jesus is actually explaining, sometimes the bad things that happen to us for our salvation. It's reconciled. All of this stuff is reconciled in the New Testament. And what's interesting about Jude the Obscure is that Jude regresses backwards instead of forwards. And his aunt tells him that his mother drowned herself. Okay, so the father does eventually die, but he left her. She drowned herself. And it's what does Jude do next? He thinks, I'm doomed. And he goes, there's like a frozen pond, and he has this kind of feeble attempt of suicide. He goes out in the middle of the pond, jumps, tries to break the ice. Didn't work, but it's just interesting to me that you get that information and then you immediately think about drowning yourself because that's what your mother did. So there's kind of that sense of the father of connection that, sometimes bad marriages do run in families. So sometimes there are certain problems that come up, and this isn't something that's really that old-fashioned. We do it all the time. Well, that family is, like that anyways. And we really associate people with their relatives and who they're around. So what is Jude to do now? Okay, let me read this part. What could he do of a lower kind than self-extermination? What was there less noble, more in keeping with his present degraded position? He could get drunk. Of course that was it. He had forgotten. Drinking was the regular stereotyped resource of despairing worthless. He began to see now why some men boozed at inns. He struck down the hill northwards and came to an obscure public house. On entering and sitting down, the sight of the picture of Samson and Delilah on the wall caused him to recognize the place as that he had visited with Arabella on the first Sunday evening of their courtship. So there's the archetype. There's Samson. Samson loses his power by a woman. Jude is losing his power is his intellect. His power, the only thing he's got going for him is that he's intelligent and that he's a reader. That's so important. And she's taken that away from him, that power. And, the getting drunk thing is, people do this all the time when they've had a bad day. And it seems to happen more when you have a bad life. And there was no different when people lived horrible lives, like during the Industrial Revolution. If you read Hard Times, one of the arguments behind not giving the workers, who they called the hands, more money, is because if you gave them more money, they would just spend it on alcohol. They would get drunk. They don't know any better. But why would they be alcoholics? I think any of us who were in similar circumstances would be too, because they were horrible circumstances, and it wasn't like you were going to get a raise or promoted or progress. No, you stayed right where you were, and that dissatisfaction causes one to drink, do drugs, you know, whatever addiction that, you know, might be there, it's going to come out when your life becomes, well, when there's no hope, really. When things just seem hopeless. This is where you turn. Now, fortunately for him, when he gets back home, Arabella has decided to leave him and go back with her parents. And it's kind of funny because they auction off the stuff, and he ends up visiting the place where the auction took place, and he sees a framed picture of himself. And she even sold that. And the guy is trying to sell it to Jude, not realizing that this is his. And Jude buys it back for a shilling or whatever. And it just kind of goes to show that it's, he didn't mean anything to Arabella. They were married. Just a while back, they promised, remember that sarcastic verse of Hardy's, that nobody thought there was anything wrong with the fact that they were, you know, making these vows to each other, till death do they part. She doesn't even want to keep a picture of him. She does not care. She's a very calculating person. And I think Jude, you can kind of see he's probably relieved, but he's a little more sentimental about it. And not only does he get some of his things for the auction for her, but he gives her all the money he has. And, you know, he's always with the right intentions. But look what he's already starting to fall into. First it was lust. Now it's alcohol. And so when you're someone like Jude, you're more susceptible to these things. You're actually even more susceptible to infatuation, because you need to feel wanted and loved and all of that. So as he's walking away, though, from the auction, he goes back to the place where he had inscribed, it says, thither, and there's a hand pointing to Christminster. And it's like a new idea comes over him. And he says he might battle with his evil star and follow out his original intention. By moving to a spot a little way off, he uncovered the horizon in a northeasterly direction. Facing east is important in a church. It's towards the east. That's where he's headed. There actually rose a faint halo, a small, dim nebulousness, hardly recognizable save by the eye of faith. It was enough for him. So he sees a sign. And I know most of us have done this. You want something. You're looking for a sign. You know, or somebody dies and, you know, there's two butterflies and you're like, oh, there's Grandma and Grandpa. And there must be something to it, I think, if we naturally do look to the universe for a sign. But, you know, notice that the guiding star can also be like in Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed. The stars can align for you, or they can conspire against you. You don't know. It's like, you know, the Greek tragedy. You're just on this wheel of fate, wheel of fortune. And it's going and going, and everybody's going to go up and they're going to go down. But this brings new light in him. He would go to Christminster as soon as the term of his apprenticeship expired. He returned to his lodgings in a better mood and said his prayers. So notice now, he's now repenting. He's redeeming himself. He just disgraced himself a little bit before. But the nice thing is, you can fall down and you can get back up, and you have this cycle of redemption. And this is not uncommon even among people who have become saints in the church. If you look at the life of St. Augustine says that he was saved by his mother's tears. His mother was St. Monica, and she's a very pious woman. later on, Dostoevsky has, I don't know if people just said this about him or if he came up with it, but it was, I think he really addressed the sinner and the saint, the one who is so bad. Well, like St. Paul, you know, when he was Saul, you know, and this murderous guy ends up becoming this wonderful saint if they follow the fulfillment of the New Testament. But like I said before, Jude isn't going to go there. He's going to go backwards, because that's kind of the tragedy in itself. Part of this tragedy is the tragedy of the religious struggle, I think. So at any rate, I'll stop there and see you next time at Christminster. All right, thanks.